Welcome back to today's episode of the Psychedelic Mom Podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Carlin, and I'm here today with a dear friend, Butterfly. His legal name is Tony Pham, and I met Tony originally in a psychedelic facilitation training program, and he's here today to talk about what has happened in his life since I've seen him last, which is a lot. He started meditating in 2010 during a difficult time when he was questioning all the stories people told him about who he was supposed to be. His heritage is Buddhism, and he's a facilitator and healer that occupies the intersection of queer and BIPOC identities. He is also a second-generation Vietnamese American whose parents came over during war. Butterfly is a ceremonial leader and ethical steward of spiritual practices rooted in compassion, indigeneity, and sacred lineage. In addition to supporting private medicine clients as a sitter in the United States, I know you did this intense 3-year training program and have just come back from Gabon, where you got initiated. So I'm dying to hear about that.
Thanks for the introduction. It's so good to be here with you again. Yeah, so since I completed Rainbow Bridges with Antonia, who I believe you've also had on this podcast, who's wonderful, I was enrolled in a 3-year program that's based out of South America. And they're renaming, the new name is going to be called Ecstatic Mysticism, a mystery school in some ways, but also applying various modalities to help bridge some of the tools that we've developed in the West with honoring the traditions and wisdom that have historically been stewarded in the global South. So I'm now in my last semester of that program. It's been such a journey these past 3 years. And I recently came back from Gabon, as you mentioned, in Central West Africa, where I've made it through to the other side. I completed the initiation with that powerful teacher in medicine as well.
Wow. I know you had mentioned that it's pretty rigorous, that a good portion of those that started didn't finish. So for anybody out there who is interested in facilitating medicine and feels in some ways this could be their path, how would you describe this particular program and its intensity and what you learned?
Yes, I am all for various modes of education and training and apprenticeship. My journey has certainly been a mixture of all the above. I think for me, what was really calling about this particular program was the substantiveness of it and the commitment that was required. We're in this cohort for 3 years. Each semester, we're expected and asked to travel internationally. And each semester, we spend time with a different medicine, psychedelic, and really both from an academic and experiential, cultural lens, seek to cultivate respect and appreciation and more skill and capacity in working with all of these different allies that are out there. I think one thing to know about ecstatic mysticism, and that's part of why I was drawn to it, is that it is grounded in a non-Western framework, right? So it's going to be very different than a traditional university program that you might find in the global North. And I think that can create discomfort for some people because it's not just all about okay, I'm going to hear a lecture and then take a test and now I'm qualified. That's not the premise of this program. And that's not, in my experience, what helps someone to really step into whether or not they have the capacity and calling to be a facilitator. I feel so fortunate and blessed that we've had the invitation to be with communities that have been working with these medicines for generations, for centuries, and there's also a aspect of not just coming in and taking and having this be another badge or another thing to put on a resume. It's really how to cultivate right relationship and reciprocity. And so many of us, still are so deeply touched by what we've been given that we choose to then give back to the communities and just really want to recognize and respect that type of exchange.
And there is a lot of talk in the psychedelic world about reciprocity and giving back. But how would you say it's done in a way with deep integrity and not just become like a buzzword within this field?
That's, I feel like each person has to find their own sense of ethics and integrity. And like, I'm thankful to teachers like Kalea Taylor who provide frameworks. And ultimately, it's about spending time within and understanding that none of us got here by ourselves. And so what does that mean in terms of being able to show up for others? And so for me, when it comes to reciprocity, and I'll give it an example because I think that can be helpful, is as you mentioned, I'm a guest facilitator and integration specialist with Tandava in Mexico that offers 5-MeO-DMT. Now, that is a medicine that has risen in popularity recently, and that means that you see how capitalism and other systems are wanting to exploit it, which has happened throughout history. So you see people listing on Airbnb experiences in Tulum, like, oh, I can give you a toad journey. Or you see people just so eager and perhaps misguided to facilitate that they're like, oh, good, I wasn't sure how to get medicine, but I finally got some. And they have no idea where it came from or how it was sourced. And so I think it's really important to consider if the intention is healing, has there been any harm caused along the chain of custody for this medicine to get to you? And if one doesn't know the answers, I would say there's some room to really step forward and be in integrity there. And when it comes to the reciprocity, even if you're working with synthetic 5, which I primarily choose to for various reasons, including sustainability, that means we understand that many of us wouldn't have known about synthetic without the organic. And the bufo toads are indigenous to the Sonoran Desert. And so what is the sense of contribution to those lands and also the communities that live on those lands, the Yaqui, the Seri, other people in those areas that are quite impoverished. And so how to really be with our hearts and say, okay, well, how do I help to give back if I really feel like something has benefited me, and to do so in a way that does not continue these patterns of colonialism, extraction, saying, we're the outsiders, we know what's best, here's what we think you need, right?
So let's back up a little bit. How did you even come to the psychedelic path?
Yes, for me, couple things. Like you said, I started meditating in 2010 when I realized, I had had some level of professional success, and yet there was still an emptiness, something that just didn't feel whole or fulfilled. And that's similar to many of the clients that I see. And that's what led me to my first 10-day silent meditation course in the Goenka Vipassana tradition. And so that experience of going inward and really being with all of the thoughts and feelings and attachments and seeing how the aversions and desires create so much suffering That was certainly one thread. And then another thread as well was I very much through flow and friendships and community had been visiting a friend in Puerto Rico. She had mentioned she sat with ayahuasca, and I expressed interest. And so that was my first time sitting with that beautiful teacher. And at the end of that journey, what arose between me and the curandero, because it was a one-on-one session, which I didn't know was not necessarily how it usually works.
Right.
He offered to me, have you considered that MDMA for your generation could be what LSD was for mine? And I said, no, I don't know. I think most people use it as entertainment and recreation and escape. But that planted a seed in me to then just let community and friends know that I'd be willing to sit and hold space. And, you know, if you're interested in trying to work with it in a way that's not just in a party club environment. And so that's the very beginning of how all of this started.
Amazing. Were you back then as calm and centered, and you have such a beautiful presence about you that I know a lot of that comes from the meditation, but have you always kind of had this nature?
I don't think it was always as accessible. I think it was always there. I think part of my journey has been understanding that within my ancestral lineage, there's a lot of trauma. As you mentioned, my parents are refugees of the war that the US government perpetuated against Vietnam. And imagine the layers of trauma of being told that we're here to save your country, and then overnight being abandoned, and then coming to a country in which there's racism and classism and all these systems of oppression. And so I really respect and love that my parents did the best that they could and continue to do so. And I've recognized there's a lot of unaddressed trauma that they've coped with through denial that I now have been working on. And so through that work and through that process, that's how I've been able to reach a more grounded place versus a place of greater heightened anxiety and just searching for safety that may have existed previously.
Just going back to ayahuasca and then this idea of sitting with other people with MDMA and diving into your own generational trauma and history, how have you felt that psychedelics have supported your journey? Has it been similar to the path of Buddhism?
Yeah, there's an expression about, there's so many gates to the Dharma. And so for me, when people say, oh, I feel like I can access those states of connection and ease through breathwork, I say, yes, you can, right? And it's not an either or, it's a both and. And so we're so fortunate that there's so many practices, modalities, tools, faiths, lineages available. I think for me, the journey has been about seeing what aligns and what resonates and what wants to organically unfold, and to be able to have the space to meet presence as it genuinely arises. And so certainly working with sacred medicines, entheogens, having the opportunity to sit abroad with psychedelics has been a very, I would certainly describe it as one of the primary threads of my spiritual tapestry. I talk about it as being the Dharma, queerness, and sacred ceremonies.
Ooh, I love it. I love it. And you are really holding space for the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities. In the beginning of your bio, it said you really began to question who everybody told you you were. So how did that play a role in who you are and who you choose to serve?
Yes. Picking up on where I shared, my parents came to this country on a boat, literally, each of them separately. And so many people, more than half the people who tried to make that journey across the Pacific didn't survive. And so I understand that when they came to the US, for them, it was about providing their children that they were going to have with a better future. And because of the systems that exist, there's a cultural conditioning around, well, that means financial and professional success that looks a very specific way. And so I would say that period of questioning around 2010 was like, wait, is there more to who I am and to the life that I want to lead than a title on a business card? Right. And so I think those are the types of questions that I started sitting with and poking at. And as for me, those things lose the glamour. And there's more, for me, disillusionment of how money and work is the be all end all. I certainly think that doing something that you find fulfilling and that gives you resources is important. I just don't believe that money and a certain status on the career ladder defines who I am. So then where does that go? And I think for many BIPOC folks, queer folks, children of immigrants, I have so much compassion based on my own experience that of course one would want to just fit in and have some ease and these markers of acceptance and belonging. My journey has taught me that nobody else can give us that acceptance and that belonging and that validation that as humans we of course need. It has to come from within, from a place of self-acceptance and self-love. And so as we are able to not have our traumas dictate the way that we experience reality, there's more room to step into that authenticity, which I think is so important for resilient communities, and that I feel particularly called to be of service to.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Just you're speaking of like the presence, and I asked you before, have you always been like this? And I loved your answer in saying, yes, it's always been there, but it's the ability to tap into that presence, this three-pronged path. So how would you say that 5-MeO-DMT, this medicine that has become really important to you in your work with others, has supported the community that you are serving? And if it's not 5-MeO-DMT, what other medicines do you feel has supported some of the healing of generational trauma, of identity, of coming to that place of, even for the first time, feeling viscerally that presence within?
Yeah, thanks for opening that up. For me, I personally feel it's important to sit for medicines with which I feel a sense of not just experience and skill, but also relationship. And so that is MDMA and 5-MeO and DMT. And to pick up with your question, when it comes to 5-MeO DMT, I was introduced to that medicine through a queer elder. I did not know about it at all. It was not on my radar. I wasn't looking for it. And just very much through synchronicity did it get presented. I was invited to sit for my first time. And that's how it all began. If even you had told me, 10 years ago, could you imagine that you would be facilitating for Five at Tandava and helping people to integrate? I'd be like, what is Five? What are you talking about? Why would I do that? And,
Yeah.
and I think with the experiences I've had of sitting with, receiving, assisting, apprenticing, now facilitating, integrating, I've seen that it's the complexity and the non-duality of healing identity-based trauma, because I can relate to how there is resistance of, what do you mean we're all one, when many of us live in a reality, and if we're of resilient identities, regularly experience that there are some individuals that wish to cause us harm for the very bodies that we inhabit. And so the topic of oneness I think it's really important to not just be like, oh, we're all one. It's like, yes, and let's slow down and really soothe and heal the parts that have been so wounded. And I think when we're able to do that and see how, in many ways, those of us who seek to do this work come to a place of understanding that we're doing this work for the generations that came before us and that will come after us, then it's like, okay, yes, like, even though this body has inherited and experienced harm, trauma, I choose not to let that control, define my experience of life. And I think that's what creates the spaciousness to then really be able to experience somatically and embody not just an idea of interdependence and connection and oneness and wholeness, but really know it for yourself. And that's where there's so much power.
Yeah. So the healing of the traumas of generations and one's own work. I love what you're saying about the non-bypassing, like we're all one and it's all collective. And let's talk about what it's really like to heal trauma. What does that journey really look like? How difficult for you has it been to go in and feel the wounds, not only of yours, but yes, that live within you from your parents, to use both meditation and your spirituality and medicine to really go into these difficult places in your life?
It's incredibly challenging. I think it's some of the hardest work that anybody can do in their life, and potentially multiple lifetimes if that's your belief system. My experience is that when I really allow myself to feel the depth, the weight of the suffering, as my Dharma teacher Lama Radones talks about, that's when the heartbreak happens. And that's when there's so much grief, and it's just like, wow, there's just like, oh, like how can there be so much pain? It can feel quite daunting. And I think that's where, for me, the practice of compassion is so important. To be able to sit with how can I hold that, of course, people, myself included, make mistakes. And I choose to see that there's a difference between reacting from a place of not being conscious and responding from a place of greater awareness. but I'm not, even today, I'm not always in a place of greater awareness. If I'm
Mm-hmm.
running late to the airport, I might not be as friendly to
Mm-hmm.
the taxi driver, right? And so I think there's humility involved as well. This being
Mm-hmm.
human is not for the faint-hearted. It is not easy. And so I think that's where, amidst all the suffering, it's also yeah, I understand that this is huge work that we're all doing
Mm-hmm.
together as a species on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thankful to all the people who have been supportive and encouraging of me on this path. And I feel a call to be able to show up in that way for other people as well, because I've seen it's possible. And,
Mm-hmm.
if somebody looks at me and says like, oh, I feel like there's something there, then, perhaps I can be the one to extend that helping hand.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because you started with the practice of your heritage is Buddhism. So you had that foundation. I started meditating years ago. As a matter of fact, I was remembering the other day that we had silent meetings as like middle schoolers that we would go sit for 15 minutes. And it wasn't a Buddhist tradition. But one of the things that's interesting is I kind of studied a lot of Buddhism and different religions before medicine, but didn't really have understanding of a lot of it. And then medicine work came along, and what we're just talking about, kind of that existential grief and sometimes terror and all the things that we hold as individuals, but also the collective wound. What's been interesting for me is doing medicine work and then coming into non-duality and feeling a deeper kind of understanding of maybe the purpose of it all, or I don't even know if it's purpose, but that there's something deeper here happening than just me healing my trauma, that these traumas and solidities within me open me up to something much greater. And how would you describe non-duality? I don't know, you experience non-duality and then there's a deeper wanting to understand what's actually happening.
Yes. For me, when I think of non-duality, I think of paradoxes.
Mm-hmm.
These concepts that to the rational mind are irreconcilable in some ways. And so the idea of daytime and nighttime coexisting, some people might be like, that's not possible. That doesn't happen. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
but doesn't it? Like, how would
Mm-hmm.
one exist without the other?
Mm-hmm.
Or sadness and joy. Some people might be like, those are opposites. In my experience, my journey has shown me that the more I permit myself to feel melancholy, the sweeter those moments of happiness are. And I wouldn't be able to touch into the ecstasy if I wasn't willing to feel the deep sorrow. And so for me, that's non-duality, seeing that it's not
Mm-hmm.
the either or ever. It's always the both and the complexity of it. And part of it has also been about letting go of this idea that my mind has to understand everything for it to be true. My journey so far has shown me that there is a faith to mystery and the unknowable. And that's something that many traditions around the world have known for a very long time. And I think, unfortunately, those of us who live in modernity and what we consider to be, more advanced civilization have forgotten that. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and so that's kind of how I relate to non-duality.
Well, let me just ask you a question there, because sometimes, with even non-duality and this idea of awakening and enlightenment, I noticed in myself at times even westernizing that as a goal to get to. And I'm curious about that for you. Is there this deep desire to be fully enlightened?
mm, I'm going to answer that a couple ways. One is that, at the beginning of the Gregorian calendar year, it's common for folks in the global north to say, like, what's your New Year's resolution? And that's a very objective orientated question. So for me, I approach it more as
Mm-hmm.
what's my intention? And
Mm-hmm.
so, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
also this aspect around, I certainly relate as somebody who went to school in the US and having certain conditioning from education. Like, I want to get the best grade and accomplish the goal the fastest and all
Mm-hmm.
of those things. And yet I can also, I see how that's so ephemeral and ultimately illusory. It doesn't really exist in that construct. That's not the, for me, there's a sense that that's not really the truth. The
Mm-hmm.
enlightenment, awakening, they're words that can be helpful, but
Mm-hmm.
in Buddhism we talk about, like, don't fixate on the finger pointing at the moon, look at
Mm-hmm.
where it's pointing at the moon, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
many teachers, especially in Buddhism, would say we're already free.
Mm-hmm.
We just
Mm-hmm.
have forgotten it, and we've put ourselves in our own jails of suffering. And Thich Nhat Hanh said people are so afraid to let go of their suffering because they become so used to it, so comfortable with it. They're attached to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, that's the paradox. It's like, I want to
Mm-hmm.
be enlightened. What do I need to do? Tell me all the things. What
Right.
diet I need to go on? Like,
Uh-huh.
what retreats? Like,
What medicine
what
is going to wake
medicine?
me up fastest?
Who do I need to study with? All these things. And it's like, but that's actually moving us further away,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's that
Mm-hmm. It is the
grasping.
paradox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it before. It's kind of desire and aversion. The two things that really cause our suffering is desiring things to be anything different than they are, and the resistance to anything being different than it is.
hmm
What a practice.
Yes. It's that's why we call it practice.
So, what was it like, the iboga initiation? I want to just kind of jump here because it's been something that I have felt called to, and yet seems a little daunting. And I'm curious about your experience getting initiated.
Honestly, it's not something I ever wanted to do. When I first heard about iboga, I was like, no thanks, I'm good. Just because I feel like there's a narrative around it of being very, and again, it's this global north Western construct. I think, like,
Mm-hmm.
we want to, like, categorize things like, well, iboga is
Exactly.
really tough and really dark
Mm-hmm.
and da 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 da. It's like we're so addicted to the story of it all, right?
Mm-hmm. And the
Instead of
comparison of this medicine,
exactly
that medicine, is being like, oh, that's a bigger peak. And, oh, you're going to
right,
go deeper into your shadow with that one. It's just so,
right.
it's that Western idea of these medicines. And yeah.
It's so absurd. It's like, oh, well, that means you're tougher then, right? And it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
none of this is a contest, and even making it a contest again is so far from the idea of collective
Mm-hmm.
liberation. For me, because it was offered as part of the program that I'm completing, I really sat with how, at this point when I travel, I prefer to travel if there's some sort of calling synchronicity. And this trip felt like not just tourism or a vacation. It's no, we're being invited into a community because of the relationships of our program directors, because of the integrity and the respect that people view them with. And so even though I knew it would be very challenging and difficult, and it was, and I trusted in the manner that the invitation was getting offered. And there's a couple layers to this. One aspect is the medicine work, the initiation, the working with the plant itself. And the other is just, now that I've gone, I will share that for me, I am not someone who had ever been to that part of the world before. And I think that in and of itself was jarring in some ways, of just the how different things were, and just noticing how my mind would be like, oh, this is not what I'm used to. And it's like, of course, isn't that what I signed up for? Isn't that what I wanted? And yet those moments of feeling discomfort, and the reality is we were in a village that's fairly remote, and there was so much care and tenderness and community that we were invited to, and that I personally received and experienced. I got sick immediately after I got there, which was like worst case scenario when traveling. And
what did you get?
I think it was just a really bad respiratory virus or flu, but I had the chills, fever, body aches, dizziness. And I remember one of the grandmothers came to me and just wanted to sit by me. And I was like, oh no, I'm sick. But she didn't care, right? She just wanted to check in on me. And I don't speak French, which is the common language there. And so we were just being with each other. And I was very moved and touched by that as one example. And then the initiation itself, much of it is we've been asked to not share, just because we want to respect that in that community, it's meant to be sacred. And so if you choose to go through it, then you will know. And otherwise, it's not necessarily for public information.
What can you say that it taught you about you? And what did it teach you about the medicine iboga?
I noticed that I do sometimes have a tendency, especially living in New York, to rush and to hurry. And one of the aspects of the medicine I welcomed and really was humbled by was slow down, soften, listen. So that was really, that felt really significant. And I think there's also, again, going back to community. It's the opposite of hyper-individualism that exists in capitalism, the global north. I would be outside of the initiation, I would be in the village and babies would be put into my hands because everybody takes care of the children, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and within the initiation, to see how much care, presence, love that in my case, the initiated men of the community put into the experience for us was, I was filled with a lot of gratitude, because it was very difficult for me as a participant, as an initiate. And then with that context and understanding, really having respect for how much everybody was putting in to be able to hold that space for me and the 5 other men who were there. But I will say, depending on dosage, it does last for quite a while. The initiation was 3 days, 2 nights, or 48 hours, during which maybe other people slept, but I didn't really sleep that much. And so you're working with exhaustion, being in a deep medicine state. So there's a lot to be with.
What would you say that the medicine taught you?
It brought me to a place of humility and gratitude. Humility because I'm someone who sat in multiple residential silent meditation retreats. As a practitioner, I've had intense medicine experiences. I'm somebody who has spent time by myself on wilderness quests where I'm alone with no food or water. So I came in like, I have some foundation, and it was very humbling to see how there were absolutely moments of struggle, and how I'm still in some ways surprised. I made it through to the other side and completed. And then the gratitude of, alongside my ego saying like, this is so hard, this is so uncomfortable, there were absolutely moments of awe and beauty and being in the community, in ceremony, and seeing how it's just woven into the fabric of who they are and how they live. And what an honor and a gift to be able to take part in that.
Wow. Spiritually, being a Buddhist, what did it feel like as far as like their tradition and your tradition? What did that feel like?
Well, something that was coming up for me is, interestingly, Vietnam is a country that was formerly colonized by France, and so is Gabon. So there was some historical connection there. In terms of different spiritual practices and faiths, I didn't feel it was contradictory, really, because again, it goes back to this openness of saying like they're just different gates, different paths, getting outside of the comparing mind, which causes so much suffering, and saying, what an opportunity to learn, how lucky am I? And really feeling appreciation for my ancestry and my lineage and my teachers, that I can bring meditation into deep medicine states. I'm always find it, I don't understand how other people who don't meditate can do it, because I'm like, I don't know how I would do it if I didn't have my practice.
I don't know how you survive, actually. Like, I don't know how you survive without a meditation practice. I mean, for all the parts of me that still, hijack me, and for, all the, it's, how do you do it? I don't know.
It's a mystery to me as well.
Yeah. In your work, how important first was it to integrate iboga? And I know you're just recently back. What has the integration been like so far? And then let's talk a little bit about the importance of integrating both medicine and what you learn in your Buddhist practice.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the integration process is still unfolding. I really found it helpful that our teachers told us, this is a process that may unfold over the next year, right? I've talked to other people who've gone through the initiation, and 6 months later, they're really in deep process. And so I think in many ways we'll see what comes up. I will
Mm-hmm.
share that immediately when I came back, there was a little bit of just shock in some ways of just like, what just happened? Like, I think the mind had a difficult time just being like, wait a minute. And then now there's more spaciousness to be with the non-duality, not just be in that place of, that was so hard, and to open up to the gratitude, which then welcomes in more of the insights. And so those are just only slowly starting to arise, I feel. And then on the topic of integration in general, I think for me, whether it's breath work, meditation, medicine work, whenever I enter a peak experience, an altered state, it's common to be like, oh, wow. The truth of it is, the work and the practice of this is that if we want to see change in our day-to-day, we have to integrate. It doesn't exclusively happen in these non-ordinary states. The responsibility is to then reflect, exercise, draw, play music, sing, share, be in nature, whatever it is, to really be putting our energy and our consciousness into bringing in what we've touched into our more regular routines.
Do you have some favorite practices? Like, even do you have certain meditation practices that you really like?
A couple of meditation practices I find helpful. One would just be around restorative, because I think in many times we underestimate or really don't realize how much we put our systems through when we are in these expanded states. And so just going into like yin yoga, resting, yoga nidra.
Is that like a do nothing meditation?
It's a do nothing, but even like, that's the trick of it. Because even doing nothing, people try to do nothing. And I'm like, no.
I'm doing nothing. Can't you see? Nothing is happening.
I'm winning at doing nothing. Yeah. So yes, and yeah. And then absolutely the compassion, because I think when we go into expansion, there's more availability. Sometimes some of our armor and resistance will fall, and we'll be like, oh, wow, I do choose to constantly be in that pattern or loop. And then when we're out of it, it can be tempting and seductive to shame ourselves, to be embarrassed, to judge ourselves. And so that's where compassion practice and meditation is also really helpful. And I also think journaling is a really a foundation for integration. I know not everybody is a writer. So then I say, draw something, play some music, dance, move, bring it into the body. I'm a big fan of dancing. And then also sharing, with the caveat that the sharing happens with individuals that can really hold and honor the experience. I think it can be deflating and disempowering when we are not discerning about who we choose to share with.
Yeah, I know even in like the program that we did together, just having those weekends, I think it was 7 to 8 weekends during the year where we got together in person to be part of each other's experiences and ups and downs in the process. That sharing together was pretty amazing. I also remember your mosquito bites.
Oh yeah, I had that happened in Gabon too. Mosquitoes apparently.
I was wondering
really
that as you were talking about it. They like you.
They're drawn to the type of blood I have, I guess. Yeah, and just one more key integration tool is for those that find it supportive, certainly a therapist that can hold your experience without judging it. And I think when I think of therapy, it doesn't have to be like a traditional one. It could be somebody who works in a modality like internal family systems, for example.
One of my favorite. My goodness. Wow. So there's so many areas I want to go with you, honestly. I want to ask this quick question about non-duality, because you're really just talking about now about different practices, right? And integrating what we learn in medicine or the new insights from meditation, wherever they come into our lives. And sometimes in non-duality circles, you can hear things like, it's just all happening. It's just, there's no doer. Even the witness is separation in a way. What is your thoughts on that, like the individual choice and practices that we have every day, and this idea that there's really no doer and no free will?
I mean, I think for me, the non-duality comes in because it's the paradox of there's absolutely free will and there's no real such thing as free will. And both are true and they coexist, right? And so that in and of itself is quite the illustration of what we're talking about here. And for me, I'm somebody who doesn't particularly find it helpful or healthy to get into go down the road of like, oh, it's just ego, because the reality is we need our egos to survive in this world. And without a sense of identity, how would we then be able to reference non-duality, right? So like I was saying, how would you know the idea of day without night? And how would you know this idea of it's all just happening if not for the experience of the ego trying to control everything and thinking that you're the one who's in charge of everything, right?
And probably the same paradox too of it all being one. How would you know that without having a sense of identity, of feeling separation at some point?
Exactly. Like when we talk about awakening, how would you know that that's what you aspire to, that's what you long, if you weren't already sleeping? And how would your heart know to cry for liberation if you didn't feel like you were trapped?
And yet I loved what you said before, that also freedom is right here too. It is the paradox.
Yeah, it's not somewhere else. It's not contingent upon completing a checklist.
Nope.
It's right here. And I think this is also that piece around not being so fixated on the rational mind. And this is where just meditating on the breath, that's where it is. Right?
What do you think, like, as far as serving medicine, I know you said that facilitating medicine and the ways that you are doing it in the communities that you're doing it in such holding space with such compassion and integrity. And going back to this time of thinking if someone had said to you, you were going to be a medicine holder, carrier, facilitator, you would have been like, you're out of your mind. What has been both the beauty and the difficulty of this path serving medicine in the United States?
I think it's important to navigate the reality at any given moment. And so in the US, I choose to sit and hold space and provide support to people in that way. Whereas abroad, like at Tandava and other places, then I will facilitate. And for me, the umbrella thread around all of it is integrity. It's hard because it's such a big responsibility. I often reflect and talk with colleagues about how doing this work is a sacred responsibility that calls upon a practitioner to really make sure that they are also actively looking at their own shadows and wounds. Because if we don't then it becomes very easy to get on a slippery slope of not realizing when we're getting triggered, which makes it very difficult to hold a space of love for somebody else and acceptance and really allow them to show up authentically. And also, this is, in my opinion, why historically there are sometimes harms that are caused from a facilitator, practitioner to someone who's receiving. I think it's because it's what happens when people bypass and are unwilling to do their own work. And then the beautiful part is being of service in a way that has existed for a long time in some communities. We seem to be at a moment where perhaps in the global north now, there's a resurgence in terms of the interest. And because I've been blessed with certain teachers, mentors, elders, I feel that there is a call to be able to show up for others and offer the experience, the skills, the ethics, because unfortunately I don't feel like some people are doing that. So, yeah.
Have you ever felt when you've received medicine or been, the receiver of medicine, any harm?
Yes, and I think, harm's a big word. There's a spectrum of harm. I think that one thing I do reflect on is that I've been in spaces where there's people of a variety of demographics, backgrounds, identities, and I think sometimes that harm is caused when there's a lack of awareness around white privilege and the amount of space that somebody may be taking up and things that are said that might be triggering to other people. And it's like, yes, I understand that you're in your process and like you're really excited about this, but that might actually be causing harm to other people of resilient communities that are living what you're talking about as like a new thing that you just realized that is huge. And other people in the space may be very intimately aware of it. And so there's that tension there, right?
Have you felt that psychedelics have been really supportive to the BIPOC community that you serve?
I can only speak from my own experience. I will share that for the queer people that sit with me, for the BIPOC folks that sit with me, those at intersectionality, they have told me yes. One thing I'm very aware of is, like in many fields, there aren't necessarily an abundance of people at my intersection that are doing this work. And I think it's important that there are, and people want to feel that relationality and that affinity. But I'll give an example of somebody who has sat with me and had said, he'd been through a lot of therapy. It really wasn't working. He was prescribed medication. He felt it was numbing him from life, creating a barrier between him and the world. And then one time we were having an integration session, he shared that he ran into somebody on the subway. And that person he hadn't seen in a while. And so this friend of his said, wow, what's changed? You look so different. You're not the person I remember. You just seem so happy and you're glowing. And he said, yeah, I've been doing some work, some healing with psychedelics. And, and then he said this friend that he ran into started crying, was like, oh my gosh, I can just feel how you're just so much happier. Like, and so for me to have held space for that, what a gift. And so I'm thankful to be a part of his own healing to unfold organically. And I think for any facilitator, it is really important to have a mix of always be open to feedback from who you're sitting for, from colleagues and peers, having that co-visibility, and then also from mentors, elders, and teachers. And that's, those are some of the ways that I find helpful to make sure that I stay ethical and in integrity.
Mm-hmm. Any place you'd like to take this conversation?
Well, I guess I'm curious about what we were discussing on, training and, since you and I shared an experience, and you've continued on your journey as well, for us to maybe just chat a little bit about how to navigate education and training and learning for a space, a type of work that doesn't necessarily fit into a traditional model, right? And yeah, I always think that's like an interesting topic.
I do too. It's fascinating because I think the program that you talked about is so interesting because, again, you're going to the very places these medicines have been held, and they're the sacred medicines, and you're getting to experience those cultures and the communities around it. And that doesn't mean probably that everybody that did your program might be suited to serve medicine. So this is some of the things that I've seen, is that as much as some of these things were said to me when I started down this path myself, I don't know that I understood until I lived certain things. I didn't have even certain understandings about myself. Like when people said that, it's really hard to serve medicine. You can only take someone as deep as you've gone. Like those are like phrases until you actually are in that space. And you talked about the importance to keep doing your own work. And again, when you're beginning on this path, it's just kind of a phrase like, I've done therapy. I've tapped into some wounds, but this is like goes deeper and deeper and deeper. I think that's surprising. I think when I came into the space, there was this idea like, oh, you heal your wounds and then you serve. And it's like you keep healing and you keep going deeper and you keep coming to these deeper aspects of not only your own, but the collective. You talked about the capacity to sit with grief, to have compassion for yourself, like compassion for others, to even do the work as a white woman to understand my privilege, where I sit, where I can make someone uncomfortable just by the color of my skin because of, history and truth that has happened in the world. So it's so many complex issues. And one of the other things I guess you can train for it, but it's like one's own nervous system. Like the awareness of one's own nervous system and its capacity to hold somebody else's. I think what you just said too is like getting feedback from elders, mentors, because these aren't necessarily things that you see about yourself. And we can go into a medicine space. Like I remember having a medicine experience with a medicine woman that was, very, very respected, and trauma came up, and it was the first time I kind of saw this kind of thing, and I was like, oh my gosh, is that memory? And she was like, no, oh my gosh, no, look at your life, definitely not. And I was like, oh, good, great. I can just like move on. And again, there's the realization later on, after so much time in this space, of realizing like we can only hold what we're comfortable holding. And sometimes we don't even know that. I think community is really important. Listening to others, like knowing when someone does show up like you've always had such incredible integrity. I've always loved your capacity. I was noticing even as I ask questions, I'm like, what was the beauty and what was the hard? It's like I'm kind of simply asking like the duality, like just take me to the duality, right? And I remember back, when we would have conversations and you were always pointing me to be able to hold both. And I think that capacity is incredible as someone who holds space, but also, it would be important for me to work with somebody who has a depth of wisdom teachings, a depth of connection with presence. I think it's like really complicated on how you would build a program or a training to actually teach people to serve medicine well.
I agree. It's kind of like yoga teacher training. Not everybody who does it becomes a yoga teacher. Not everybody who completes my program will go on to facilitate. And even the idea of certification just feels off in some way to me about what we're working with here, right? Because when I talk to my friends who are licensed clinical therapists, they'll say, just because you have a license and put in some hours, that doesn't make you a good therapist. And at the same time, the conundrum we're in is, how do people find someone that has certain experience, qualifications, skills, ethics? And I think that's where we can learn something from the past. Maybe it's not about who has the most YouTube views or the most Instagram likes, because just because you know how to create content doesn't mean you can actually hold space. No. And we go back to the days of trust networks and referrals, right? Like if I was looking for somebody, I might ask you, or vice versa. And we know that we're not just going to give someone's name casually. It's going to be like, no, if I'm going to share someone with you, it's because there's a chain of trust there, right?
Well, I totally agree. And I did the synthesis program. And it was fascinating because my first facilitator of the year-long that I was in, she had never done psychedelics. And I thought, wow, this is really fascinating that the facilitator who's teaching people how to facilitate and holding the space for this training program and certification program that was supposedly one of the best, which cost a lot of money, by the way, had never done psychedelics. And then just with even in the group that I was in, obviously some beautiful, beautiful humans. But when they got their certification, did not make really any of them ready to serve medicine with the limited experience with psychedelics that most of them had. And so I think also working and apprenticing with the medicines themselves and having a deep respect for the medicine and like spending your time in that space enough that you are doing that deep work, both the shadow and the transcendent, it's both.
Right. Yes. And it's a real question of like, can you honestly say that you can be in a deep medicine state and hold space for others? Because that's one way to assess the situation. And people will sometimes ask me like, Butterfly, how do you do it? And, I used to have the same question when I was starting out. It's just a lot of, you have to put in the work, right? And it needs that guidance from having a teacher is so helpful. And that's why, like, for me, if I choose to sit in ayahuasca, I have a very strong preference to sit with people who've actually lived in the jungle and spent time in the jungle, because I think that is a key part of really being in integrity with that medicine and having that relationship. And then also right now we're seeing that with 5-MeO DMT, vape pens are just becoming so easy to access. And my question is, even if you're not facilitating, even if you're a maker or distributor, where's the responsibility, right? Like, you can't just say, oh yeah, I gave the keys to so-and-so and whatever happens, happens, right? Like, if they get in an accident and you didn't teach them or help them to learn how to properly drive, I feel there's some responsibility on your part. Similarly, if you're just going to give a 5-MeO DMT vape pen to anyone without even knowing who they are, I think there's some real questions to ask about, you talk about oneness and how like you're all about, let's just like help everyone to heal. But in that lack of responsible decision making, there's already harm being caused, and we can't heal at a faster rate than the harm that's being caused.
I love that. And I think it's so true. And what is it about the Western mind, even the 5 vape pen, right?
Yes.
It's like, oh, we'll wake up and heal everybody faster. We should just like dose the world with 5, And yes, maybe there's some dream of that, but it is so fascinating to think of the vape pen and like this sacred, huge, huge, huge experience. And how, yes, does it give maybe used well as far as like maybe getting somebody ready for such a huge experience? There's some benefit of having the vape pen, but you're right. It's, where does all that responsibility lie? And I don't know about you, but I know that when I first started on this path, once you have, obviously, it's like having a non-dual experience or an experience of anatta for the first time. It's like you just want that for everybody. Same with like 5, or you have that unitive experience. And I found at one time of being like over evangelical about it, in a very innocent way. I would want everybody to have that kind of experience. But I've become so cautious. I really have become so cautious of, like, we were just talking about integration. These medicines aren't easy to integrate. This isn't an easy path. I think I was like, oh, everybody here, feel this, experience this. But the reality is, if you really are on the psychedelic path for healing and even those deeper experiences of non-duality, it's not an easy path. It's a hard path, I think. And knowing that you might be inviting someone on that path that is completely not ready for it, completely, utterly not ready for their life to be disrupted, and might not have the capacity to do the integration that it needs.
What you're saying is such an important message for people to hear, because it's really not any of our places to push anyone beyond what they're ready for. Even if it's well-intentioned, it actually can be re-traumatizing. And I am so thankful that my Bufo teacher in Mexico, Piet Prieto, and I only say his name because he's transitioned out of this world, one of the things he taught me was, in sacred work, it's really important to never infringe on someone else's free will, right? We're not trying to coerce anyone, manipulate anyone, convince anyone. This needs to be a genuine calling that comes from within.
And I can even reflect back on beginning on this path of like wanting to serve medicine. And, I look back at that. And by the way, I'm not saying this as if like I don't still have looking back to do and retrospective reflections on who I am today, 5 years from now. I'm still deeply in process in life, deeply, and will always be. I look at this as like a beautiful school. to go deeper and deeper into truth and authenticity. When I look back, when I wanted to be starting on this path, like there was ego involved. There was absolutely like this idea of serving medicine and a lot of conversations about psychedelics, about what they could do. It was like right on the fringe of the psychedelic renaissance. And I definitely felt ego in it. I definitely felt this part of me that I didn't know it at the time, obviously, but this feeling of that would be a really cool job. Yeah, it's kind of cool to be a medicine woman. That sounds, yeah, I can identify with that. It's like, what? And luckily, medicine kind of can really, and so can meditation, continue to peel back those layers of falsity. But I'm sure I still have those layers of identity. They're just still falling. And I continue to trust the medicine in my path and the authentic desire to be authentic and to do this from the highest place and with deep reflection and humility, actually. Like, I don't know.
Thank you for honestly sharing that. I mean, that creates space for me to also be transparent. Like, I can relate to feeling ego when I started as well. I mean, I think, that's the nature of being human. It's funny because now I'm at a place where I'm like, there's nothing cool about being a medicine carrier. It's a lot of responsibility.
No,
it's a lot of
nothing.
work. There's a lot of the opening up people in that way is huge. And
Huge.
whether I'm sitting or facilitating for someone, it's on me to make sure that I can be non-judgmental, in integrity, unconditionally loving. For most every person I know, that takes a lot of consciousness. And we live in a world that actually discourages us to operate that way. And so it takes a lot to show up for people.
A lot. I remember one of the first women that served me, and when I was reflecting back and telling her that I might want to go down this path, she like really tried to de-glamorize this for me. She's like, it's people like purging. It's people spitting on you. It's people like when they're talking, it's changing the sheets if somebody has an accident. Like, it's being in the depths of somebody's true despair. And also maybe holding a space for their most mystical experience in life too. Or the realization that they had some trauma they didn't know about. And you're holding the child that felt it, not the adult that is suddenly, I am having a memory of being bullied as a child. You're holding the 7-year-old child who's viscerally experiencing the trauma. And that takes an incredible amount of like love and nurturing and compassion, patience. And even going back to my ego, I think at the time too, I probably was one of those people like, oh yeah, I've done iboga, yeah, big medicine. Five is good. Like, I had that kind of idea of psychedelics and in comparison of what they were. It's just so not what the media makes it. It's so not what the psychedelic renaissance shares. These are not magic pills either. I just saw an article in CNN this week that said 1 dose of psilocybin is reported to heal treatment-resistant depression. To me, it's a very dangerous message to be putting out there. This is not true. Like, this doesn't heal treatment-resistant depression in 1 dose. There's work to be done.
Yeah.
So it's also, to be a good facilitator, is to educate those that are coming to you and say, like, let's do somatic experiencing first. Let's do some somatic inquiry. I can't tell you how many calls. I'm like the medicine woman that's like, they'll call for a consult and I'll say, we're here. If you'd like, I can show you how I work. I can just do a little somatic experiencing or inquiry with you. But you have to be totally comfortable, and I walk them through what it is. And I do that with my prep calls too, and I want to see how close is that child part? How close are they? How accessible, just by using the body, is the wounded one? And if it's right there, do we need medicine?
Right. Is it necessary? Like, are we too attached to even this idea of, well, the medicine will save me? Because, like, ultimately, nobody can, quote unquote, save us except for ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I've leaned more toward the non-dual path, because how many times are you going to do psychedelics?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many times do you have to go in? How many, and I'm not, again, I think these medicines are so profound and so beautiful and life-altering. And I am leaning more on meditation and the practices of, for example, when we know our parts and we know how they hijack us, how do we actually change the behavior? How do we learn how to actually be in presence versus the hijacked self, the child part? That happens in day-to-day life. That's the real work.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I'm feeling this way in my body. This is familiar. When did this last happen, right? It's very unglamorous. It's not fun. And it's like what you were saying. It's a knife can be used to cut up food, or it can be used to hurt someone. Medicine can be used as a crutch or as a tool. And as attributed to Alan Watts, it's like, you need to know when to hang up the phone, you know? If you got the message, you can hang up.
Right. And I just interviewed a non-dual teacher. We talked about psychedelics, and we talked about how when he does psychedelics now, and he has not done them a lot, but when he does them now, there's no content anymore. So he was talking about how you can get stuck on the content in a psychedelic and actually put conditioning upon conditioning. That the psychedelic is still mind, it's still what's happening in the mind, and that he totally believes that they're also incredible tools, but that they can also be adding more conditioning on, which I think is a really interesting perspective.
Yeah. And, we were touching upon it even a little bit when talking about the role of facilitator, sitter, or teacher. Like, we see so many people have like gotten their egos tripped up by that, right? They are deep in psychedelics, and it's like, oh, well, now look at me and who I am and what I'm doing and how people need me, and so it's so easy.
I also think it's so important, and I'm kind of at this place right now myself, like there's this part that has always been, as a mother of 4, taking care of others, and then I'm looking suddenly at this time in my life where I'm in the midst of massive change. And I was thinking of like, is it a time that I need to actually take care of myself more? And is it a time for me to step back from some of this work to really take care of myself and the big things that I have in my own life? Will I have the capacity to hold space for another in the midst of dramatic change in my life?
Thank you for your willingness to be with that inquiry. It's so important. Like, how can we be of service if we're not taking care of ourselves?
You mentioned one thing that I want to go back to. You talked about the community in Gabon that was there for you, and then also that most people that are in indigenous cultures and in communities that have been serving the medicine, they had a community around them. If you were working for Johns Hopkins, there's a team behind you. You have even protection in like everything that you do. What does it feel like to be in America, kind of in the underground?
Sure. I think that's where each person has to check in with themselves of like what feels aligned. And I think that can change. For me in the US, I choose to sit. I know other people choose to serve. I think thanks to technology, I'm able to be in community with you, even though we live in different places. And I'm still able to be in community with Joelle and Victoria at Tandava in Mexico. And so in many ways, I feel fortunate to be part of a larger global medicine community.
Yeah, me too. Did you do the Bridging Heaven retreat?
I did not, because it was during dates where I already had another commitment.
Commitment. Yeah. I agree. I think that's one of the beautiful things is the global community here, and we need each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here with me and sharing. I kind of want to know too, like, are you dating anybody? And some of the personal details that we're not getting into on this podcast, like the real,
we could do a whole
story.
Another podcast about what it's like to date if you're looking for a spiritual partner.
Yes, let's do it. Okay.
But no, I'm not currently seeing anyone.
Okay, folks out there.
Yeah, see, if you're watching this.
If you're watching this.
You can, I think the link to my Instagram will be available.
Butterfly. Well, thank you so much for doing this and being here today. I'll definitely have you back for a more spicy conversation about dating and finding a non-dual partner.
Yeah.
Or someone at least on the path.
Someone who's willing to do the work with you. Yeah.
Yeah.